Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Inverted Podcast. And you're back with the original four. Welcome back, Tom. How have you been? Yes,
Busy as I was a couple of months ago, so it is a pleasure to be with you guys.
yes. And we are very, very happy to have you back today and to hear what you've been hearing. And welcome also to Dario and Dana. I think, Dana, it's not so hot where you are, right?
No, it's probably about 65 degrees, 60 degrees here. But I just got back from LA and LA was hot.
Yeah. Some people are really suffering. And I think it's also still heating up in the world of identity, security, abuse. That's the stuff we cover on this podcast. For us, success is when nothing happens. And we cover those products, services, and things that have that unique characteristic that success is when nothing happens. And today we want to talk about the state of identity. And for those of you who don't know what we mean with that, identity is basically the way you are represented in the digital world. This could be your Google account, this could be your Microsoft account, but this could also be some agent or some app, or it could be your passport number. There's many ways you can be represented in the digital world. And that comes with lots of opportunities and problems. And so I want to start with you today, Dana. What is some of the latest things you've been seeing and how identity is changing? And then I want to toss it to Tom and Dario also to hear what you guys are hearing from clients.
I was thinking about this the other day, and it's kind of like identity was, plodding along, evolving. Things like passkeys were coming up. There was a switch from authentication focus to more on like smart authorization and communication between relying parties in the central IDP with like signal sharing. And a lot of this work was ongoing. The use of passkeys and making passkeys stronger, the adoption. And then things like AI agents came along and like really accelerated things because it threw the issues right in the face of the both not corporations and customers. It's like, all right, well, now how does an agent who's acting on your behalf authenticate and then get access to resources? And what happens if that goes awry? And now you have governments, there's some government mandates coming on board that are causing pressure to adopt certain standards and certain technology, all of which is great, but things seem to be accelerating and the change seems to be happening extremely fast to a lot of services and a lot of technology. So that was my observation.
Yeah, and it seems like the acceleration is accelerating.
Right.
I'm not sure where I heard that, right? And I think, Tom, you're with clients a lot. Obviously, we represent ourselves here, not our employers or clients. But what are some of the things you and also Dario, what have you been hearing? What have you been encountering in the market?
Yeah, I agree with everything Dana said, and the only caveat I would add is that for all that clients are interested in putting their hands around like agent discoverability and guardrails from an identity and governance perspective, they still haven't solved a lot of the other basic stuff as well. So I think one of the things that's interesting about the kind of technology acceleration that we see around agentic at the moment is that regulators haven't forgotten about also kind of like the appropriate governance of warm-bodied identities of generic users, and still we see really varying levels of maturity out there in the market. So what I see a little bit from conversations with clients and what I expect to be the trend in the next 12 months will be people will say, yeah, we need to, yes, our board, our C-suite are really kind of like being blasted from all sides with information and I'm not going to say scaremongering, but they are definitely hearing a lot of kind of like risk signals from
risk awareness.
Sure, yeah. But ultimately, I think then the people who are making like day-to-day investment decisions with regard to identity are still going to be balancing very much their time with kind of more bread and butter issues of making sure that like people can do strong authentication wherever they are, whatever device they're using, and making sure that then kind of like some form of least privilege is still applicable to all of your warm bodies while you try to figure out what you're doing with your agents. That's where the market is, I would say.
Dario, what are you hearing from the places where you walk through during the week?
Yeah, I mean, I spend a good part of my time with like technology providers and professional services provider who cater to like financial services, for example. And there we really see a shift in how the regulatory bodies are pushing companies like banks, for example, to build safer and also more privacy preserving services. Previously, we really saw that regulators were more about or pushed the companies to demonstrate their efforts of preventing bad outcome, like show your efforts in preventing privacy breaches, show your efforts in preventing account compromise, show your efforts in detecting these issues. Now the regulatory bodies are becoming much more like almost aggressive. Like they want the companies to show that they're actually preventing the outcome, and they hold the companies much more accountable. I mean, there are subtle shifts, like the companies having, like if you get scammed out of money, for example, previously you had to prove that the company did something wrong or the bank didn't fulfill their responsibility. Now the bank has to show that you really didn't meet a reasonable level of awareness or of protection. So it really shows like one of the things I see is regulatory bodies saying you have to deploy phishing-resistant authentication. Like rather than to say you should reduce phishing as a risk factor, which hasn't worked really well in the last 20 years, they now go and say, in order to be compliant, the only thing that makes you compliant is a phishing-resistant authentication method, amongst other things. Obviously, I mean, just a YubiKey doesn't make you make a bank compliant, but like they really are more prescriptive than they used to be towards the outcome rather than the effort of it, and that's I think a big change.
Can I ask you a question here,
Yeah.
Dana, and Joran and Daria? Dana, in this context. So I actually in work yesterday, my last day of work for a couple of months. I had a technical workshop with a couple of colleagues, and we were talking about kind of like how we think about defining kind of like on a paradigm level what identity security controls look like and how they're evolving for clients. And one of the big distinctions that we drew was like the distinction between like quote unquote design time controls, which is things like, you know, an enterprise role model and kind of like classic identity governance, like, you know, you apply for a role or an entitlement, you get it, it's reviewed in a year, it's aligned with the organization. But then contrasting that with kind of like runtime identity security, which is kind of authentication, it's just-in-time privilege escalation. You know, it's kind of like step-up authentication in case of like you know, a risk on the account. And what I see at the moment from a regulatory perspective is that most of your regulations are focused on design time controls. But where technology is pushing us very much and where attackers are pushing us is towards higher efficacy of runtime controls that are contextual, that take account of like things like the device you're using, things like the IP address you're coming from, things like the risk that's associated with your user object in general.
Right.
And my question is, because I do have a question, to what extent do you guys think then that the regulatory environment will start to catch up with this, let's say, this trend or this emphasis from an identity security perspective, and stop saying like, you know, for example, you know, ensure you have some form of role model, and start saying ensure that you are able to react, you know, in good time to what appears to be a compromised session.
I think it goes back to what Dario was saying is before they're prescribing, hey, you should have stronger authentication, and now they're saying, hey, you should have credentials that are phish resistant. But I think there's kind of a tail there. Like it will, as things progress in terms of, you know, wanting this more runtime controls, the governing bodies need to catch up to that. And you'll probably see the same thing as like, you should have more dynamic controls on resource access, it'll be more generic, and then eventually they'll come back and be specific. But we know the government and the regulations take time. And going back to something you said, Tom, which is like, it takes these organizations a long time to adopt, right? And like, companies are just trying to get strong authentication under their belt and modernize their identity systems, and to modernize their authorization systems are going to take a while as well. It worries me.
Also this.
Yes, and money, and that's part of the reason it takes a long time, because they have to upgrade their infrastructure. It worries me, though, because things like agents, which are basically service count, service principles, if you think of it like that, are going to force these companies to make bad decisions because they're not in the right place. So you'll have agents with embedded credentials, right? And you'll have agents that are doing impersonation instead of delegation, because that's what they need to do to get the systems to run. And that's not, I mean, it's a bad thing, but companies have to balance that, like evolving and making things work versus using what they have to get it done. And it does lead to bad choices. I think that's the challenge for these organizations, is how do you manage this stuff and evolve in this kind of new world you're going through?
I think
and so basically we've talked about this accelerated acceleration, right? And that's what we just talked about. There's an identity debt, Tom. That's what you said. Like, hey, people want to do all this agent stuff, but they don't even have MFA deployed. And then there's this, even if they do that, it's not enough because it needs to happen after that. And then there's an accelerated acceleration that then makes it very hard to take decisions. So, but I want to ask you, Dario, do you have an example of one of those sort of continuous privilege management for less technical people that are listening to this? Like, what does it mean for me as a user if we're not just after sign-in giving me all the access, but...
I mean, I think in the identity world, we used to call this risk-based signals, risk-based scoring, trust signals, whatever we want to call it, like as a continuous consumption of information that either indicates that a session that has been established by what we believe to be the right person or the right agent, to be not to be used by that entity anymore. So like a continuous check, if like, does anything change in the environment that make you believe that's the entity, and we wanted to say person, but it doesn't have to be a person anymore, controlling the session is not the same anymore. And that could be simple things like impossible travel, like the location just changed from the city center of Zurich to Jakarta. That's one of them. But I think there's a lot of more complex signals there, and the expectations from customers and regulators to use signals like that on a continuous basis to really detect that something is going wrong is increasing. So like in the past, we usually would use those signals at re-authentication time, because we said that the risk that something happens between authentication and I don't know how many hours later when you have to re-authenticate, it's a risk to accept, but that risk is not acceptable anymore because of the dynamics in the attack journeys.
And I think one other thing that this is company, I'm not sure if you've heard of them, they're called Signal.ai. They sold to CrowdStrike, I think, Eric Gustafsson, one of Eric Gustafsson's launches. And what they did was they basically let you sign in, but then you don't have access to everything. So, and then if you would go to Salesforce, for example, to manage your customers, they would give you access at that moment to Salesforce while you were at it. And when you would leave Salesforce, they would just take away that access again, so that if someone was able to hack, they wouldn't have. It's like stopping standing access, moving to basically allowing you to have access for the things you need only when you need them. And so maybe at midnight you won't need access to Salesforce, and if you do, then you have to do a bit more work, like touch your security key again or solve an SMS challenge. And I think that was a pretty interesting early take on this, because with agents, we're probably going to have to do exactly the same thing.
Right.
If I provision an agent and I want it to act in the world on my behalf, which is it's already a weird idea. Do I get a second identity, or does it just really impersonate me, or somewhere in the middle? Then what will we do? How do we make sure that that agent then can't just do everything on my account, but only has that little bit of thing that they can do for me for that task?
Right. It's like Dana's trying to access his travel info. At this point, can he only see his itinerary and not his travel ID documents, right? Because it's this point in time, and like he's not in his house, so he should only access this specific document. And the authorization checks that companies like Signal does allows you to make these micro decisions that you haven't in the past, right? That's the strength, and that's what we need with agents as well, because they're doing things on your behalf, right? And so it's all coming much more rapidly, I think, than people thought as they started this journey with authorization, right?
The way I try to look at it is like for these agents, right? Like if I would get like an employee or a service provider that would act on my behalf, this could be a travel agent that's booking on my behalf. Bigger companies, senior people have like assistants that do a whole bunch of things on your behalf. And you onboard them and you tell them, and they get to know you. And they kind of know which types of hotels you want when you're flying to, I don't know, Bangkok versus when you're flying to New York. You have different optimization criteria. Or they know that if they book you a place for dinner, that you don't like spicy food, so then you probably shouldn't be booked into some certain, like these service providers, let's call it like these humans, they know how to work for you, right? So how do we build that into agents? And how do we make sure that this sort of common sense that humans have goes into agents? And should we give them their own identity? So then it goes out and says, hey, I'm Dana's agent. I'm trying to book a restaurant. Or, hey, I'm Tom's agent. And even when it emails, this emails. Or should we say, no, here's Tom. He might speak a little bit different than he normally does. Or here's Dario. He clicks like 10 times as fast on the UI that he normally does, but it's still him, right? Like, how do we think about this agent identity versus human identity, Dario? You are muted.
It had to happen eventually. It's a good question. Like, to me, it really depends on the type of service. Like I think for most services, it's probably a type of delegation where, like we say, these agents have access to a subset of the information that I have, maybe even temporarily. And because of that, they can act on my behalf. They can get in touch with the, restaurant booking system, OpenTable, and say they're booking a table on my behalf. And I think that's the part where a lot of effort is being invested in currently to build these things. I think there's also going to be use cases where maybe I want to disguise that it's an agent doing something on my behalf. Like when I think about airlines, for example, airlines have no interest in me engaging an agent to find the cheapest airline. So the moment it's an agent, they will say, well, we can't give you a good price. So I think that there will be different situations, but in general, I think the path to go is you give the agent as little information as they need in as clear way, especially when it's about financial transactions. You limit the time they can make those financial transactions, you limit the amount they can spend, and you also give them a level of some information of intent on what you want to spend them the money for. And then they do that with their own identity, rather than just running wild with your Gmail account.
So you're saying onboard your agent assistant the way you would onboard a human assistant, basically.
I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of parallels there. I mean, the dynamics in which you onboard and offboard assistants, AI assistants, is hopefully faster than how you hire and fire your team staff. I mean, it's probably because it could be one-off agents, but in general, I think it's an HR process on steroids.
Hmm. And so we have these agents that are new to the identity space. We've said identities are no longer just an account that you have, but it's actually a collection of things you're allowed to do, and it should probably change dynamically based on a whole bunch of things. We've also talked a bit about, Dana, you said in the beginning, the authentication space changing. So now we all use passkeys and stuff like that. But what is the role for governments? And Tom, I want to bring it back to you. Like how can governments support their basically society to be safe online in a storm of digital space, cyberspace that's changing? Like I cannot imagine less tech savvy people, like for example my parents, that have to navigate this world where they're talking to AIs all the time without knowing, they're approached by AIs without knowing. It's so complex for them. How can governments help here?
I think it's a super interesting question, right? And there's for my mind an even more fundamental question here in terms of the role of governments, even before you get into kind of like safety of practices and models and things, but it's also like ownership, right? So as we know, like most of the LLMs in usage in Europe are kind of like from a sovereign governance perspective based out of the United States, maybe in China. But I think the question of who owns the compute and the IP associated with those models is one thing that governments, I know, are looking at very closely, because to a certain extent, LLM-based services, but also cloud computing, cloud infrastructure, are now at a tier of criticality towards the functioning of general society, on the same level as water, electricity, public transport and roads, right? So I think that's why you see things like EIDAS and things like kind of greater focus on, let's say, indigenous technologies in this space. So that the first things that they're concentrating on, apart from kind of empowering people as, users, citizen users, let's say, is making sure that they have their hands around kind of the regulatory and kind of like sovereignty questions of generative AI and large cloud compute before they're able to solve the more complex technical questions, let's say. But I'm interested very much in the other guys' opinions.
Yeah, Dario, you just said a term called IDaaS or something. Would one of you be able to, maybe Dario, can you explain to the audience what that means and some of the other stuff that's going on right now in this space? You're muted again. It had to happen a second time.
It had to, yes. It will happen a third time and then never again. So it's basically an European, like it's a European scheme, or the European Union has decided they want their member countries to issue electronic identities to their citizens and people living in the European Union, which means in parallel to your citizen card, to your passport, to your driver's license, you have a digital representation of who you are, what educations you have, the driver's license, all of those things, visas and things that you then can use for a variety of services. So instead of having every company bridge the world between physical documents and electronic documents, the European Union decided that the member countries need to make that bridge, so you can identify yourself. And this has a lot of implications to how.
Dario, is this like, how does this going to work? Like, am my parents going to get like a security key sent in the mail, or will it be tied to the passport? Like, what do you know about how this is going to work for people?
Yeah, so your parents are going to get an invitation that they can now use their passport or citizen card or whatever the daily method of identification is in the physical world to onboard into an identity wallet, which is like a container of credentials. It's a software, it's an application that you would then install. Every member country for the European Union will have to be forced to provide at least one wallet application to their citizens. We'll probably see one per country, or we certainly see one per country at least. And then you can identify yourselves using the passport usually. There's other mechanisms also to onboard. And then you have a representation of your passport or driver's license in a digital format, which you then can link to email addresses, phone numbers, university credentials, things like that. So it's not a physical token that your parents probably in the Netherlands will receive, but it's a digital representation that is rooted to your government-issued identification. I hope I didn't butcher it up too much. I'm sure there's UID people who think I missed out on a lot of things, but I think that's it in general.
But they're not on this podcast, so too bad for them. If you're listening to this and you're one of those, we would love to have you. But maybe Tom, a question, or Dana, a question for you. So great central government ID system. I can upload my passport and then hook up all my things. And then I want to travel or get married or do something, and then the system is down. Like single point of failure. Like how are we going to deal with that then?
Leveraged on decentralized identity practices, which is itself made to, the system should be able to keep up, and like one piece of infrastructure failing shouldn't impact the rest of it. So I mean, there might be like point in time issues for authentication, but or verification, but I don't think I think this technology is maturing enough that it'll be useful. What I was looking at and was thinking about is recovery. Like, what happens if the single point of failure is you losing your phone where your wallet is? But they seem to have captured that in what they're doing, and like you can recover your wallet just by getting another phone and then uploading your government issued ID or whatever they're using for the original identity bootstrap, and you get a new wallet. And not only that, they give you a wallet. They don't clone your wallet. It's not stored. So it's always stored on the local device, but they'll give you a new, like a V2 or a V3 of your wallet. And so it seems like it's an interesting design. It seems like it's very useful. It definitely helps with privacy, because the wallet, like, you can present your wallet and it only tells the site, are you over 18 or not? It doesn't give them your birthday. It answers questions and makes claims about you or provides claims about you that don't give away the underlying data. So like privacy wise, it seems like a great a way to do this as well. I just worry about lagging of implementation for that, because a lot of systems have to update to support this wallet and make it work. So,
but it will be like a standard, like an OpenID like standard, something like that everybody can use. So there's a lot of people behind the scenes working on this.
I mean, there's a bunch of standards. There's probably a dozen or 2 dozens of standards that need to align here. Like, there's a handful of standard bodies, with each of them has probably like a dozen standards that they need to combine. So, I mean, that's the typical European approach: is engineer perfection and then legislate it and push it out. And I think that's why we see so much more activity in Europe than, for example, in the US. I mean, in the US, we have state by state digital driver's licenses, but every state does it slightly different. So you have to make multiple implementations if you want to depend on it, but it makes it significantly simpler. In the EU, it's a construct. It's a big construct of complexity. Yes.
Not being an EU citizen, I thought you were going to say the reverse, which is they write the legislation, then you have to figure out the technology. Because if you look at the milestones that are published for this ID, it's like they're supposed to be ready at the end of this year and fully up and running at the end of next year. But then you're saying like these standards are still evolving. So, so it seems very aggressive on their end for this.
I think it is. Yes, I think it is. It caused a lot of headaches, and somebody mentioned the word about adoption, and the adoption comes also through regulation. Like, for example, today, if you're a bank, you have to provide. You have to show that you can do strong customer authentication. So, like, strong customer authentication is I always feel like it's too generic as a description to reflect what it actually is, but I think it's a limited type of multi-factor authentication, like that you use multiple aspects to authenticate the user. For example, when they want to make a payment. So we have banks now who are forced to meet those regulations if they want to offer payment capabilities, and those will whatever the time frame is, I don't know it by heart, will have to integrate with European digital wallets. So that adoption is forced by legislation, where you say, okay, you already have to meet this requirement to do strong customer authentication. Now, one of those methods to do that will have to be a digital identity or a digital wallet.
Tom, how are you hearing the industry preparing for this, or aren't they yet?
They are definitely preparing for sure, but certainly more in the realm of theory than practice as it currently stands. Specifically, the banks, as Dario already said, want to make sure that they are in line then with the requirements that are going to come to kind of have this incorporated in their client-facing business, right? But at the moment, we're seeing, certainly in Switzerland, and not necessarily any kind of, I don't see any deadlines for people going live in production yet. But certainly involved in the working groups and certainly thinking about kind of what they're going to need from a budgetary perspective in a year or two to integrate this then into their consumer-facing solutions.
So if you're a software engineer in identity, send your CVs to everybody that's legislated, like banks, whatever, to implement this European digital ID wallet. We covered a lot again, as always, and we could go on for a long time, but we all have to take a break from this heat, including the identity heat, digital identity heat. We've talked about, how identities have been evolving from a simple username passwords that's stored into like dynamic thing, which is privileges that can be shared. We've talked about how agents is changing that constantly. And we've talked a bit about, the role of government that can make sure that stuff happens safe, but also at least in Europe is now pushing a centrally defined standard of how people will be represented digitally to their banks, to their healthcare providers, and everything else that's regulated. So I think we've covered a lot. Thank you so much for the three of you. Always a big pleasure to have you on. Mm-hmm. Tom, great to have you back. And for everybody, and for everybody listening or watching us from wherever you are in the world, thank you so much. As always, connect with us on LinkedIn. And remember, stay safe. And success is when nothing happens. And when you have an air conditioning in this heat.